In your kit this month, you have 19 squares of fabric, the smaller squares of the 30s fabrics, and one large piece of white fabric. Out of the smaller ones, you have one yellow square, 6 pink squares, and you have 12 blue squares. You do have 2 of each in the blue squares. We are going to be making a grandmother's flower garden block. So you will need a package of 1 1/4 inch hexagon pieces, or you could cut your own. I'm using the pre-done ones, so that's what I will be demonstrating with. I'm going to show you a couple different ways of preparing your hexagons and a couple different ways of sewing them together. I am by no means an expert on this, and there are lots of different methods for preparing your hexagons. So if you want to look at some others, just do a search on YouTube for English paper piecing. I cut all the squares for the kit before I had the paper, so I wasn't sure how big to make them. So I cut them a little bigger than they needed to be. If you're not going to trim these down to hexagons, and I will show you that on the next one I do, then I would suggest trimming your squares down to about 3 1/4. Otherwise you have an awful lot of bulk when you're dealing with this. So I'm just going to trim this one down to 3 1/4. Sort of trying to center. It doesn't matter. When you're doing English paper piecing, you can fussy cut. We're not really going to worry about that this time. So my paper piece is my template. I'm going to use one for each square of fabric. I am putting it on the wrong side of my fabric, and there are several ways to do this. I'm going to show you 3, I guess. So I'm going to fold one edge along the paper. And in this case, I'm using paper clips to hold it. So I'm going to pop that paper clip on there, and then I'm going to go to the opposite side of where I just put that paper clip on. And I'm going to do the other side. And I'm not going to worry about doing it on all 6 sides of my hexagon. I can move my paper clips. I'll just do one more. So I'm kind of finger creasing this as I go along the edge. I'm going to put another paper clip there, and then I'll do it on the opposite side from that one. Okay, so now I'm ready to baste this. So for my basting thread, I'm just using junky old thread that I don't want to use in my sewing machine, and I don't want to count on it being strong enough for holding permanently. So I'm just using up old thread. So I have threaded it through. Take your pick of your needle. Doesn't really matter. And I'm going to start on one corner, and I'm going to take a stitch through the layers of that corner. I am not stitching through the paper. So I'm just going to take a stitch through there. And then I'm going to come back and loop over so it's a back stitch and do another one right in the same place so that I'm holding that corner in place. Okay, and then I don't really want this paper clip in my way here. So what I can do is fold down my next edge since that wasn't done yet. I'm going to just crease it with my fingers. Take my paper clip over there. And I'm going to come to the next corner and do exactly the same thing as I did before. Did I mention I did knot my thread when I started? So I came up, I took one stitch in there. I'm going to go back over and stitch again. I am not stitching through the paper. So this is 1 1/4 inch. I'm not really worried about my threads hanging here. But if I was, I could take a stitch into my fabric. Again, I'm not stitching through the paper. Now you will find some places that tell you to baste through the paper, and you can absolutely do that. There's a couple of reasons that I choose not to. One is I can reuse these papers, and they're going to last longer if I don't have stitch holes through them. And the second is if I stitch through that paper, I'm going to need to remove my basting stitches. If I'm not stitching through it, then I'm not going to have to remove my basting stitches unless I choose to. So I'm coming up to my next corner. So I'm doing exactly the same thing in every corner. That one. Pull down my next one, and I'm going to move my paper clip. You could also use magic or wonder clips, the binding clips. They would work for that. I'm going to show you another way that you don't use any clips at all, or 2 ways. Remove that one. I'm going to come up. This is my last corner that hasn't been stitched yet, so take one stitch into it. I'm just doing a stitch over this so that I'm holding my corners in place. I'm going to remove this paper clip, and I'm going to go back to my very first corner and repeat my back stitch there again. If you want to, you can knot it off, but it's not necessary. Okay, so there's my hexagon prepared, and you'll notice I did not worry about trimming off my seam allowances. This is a square. I could, it's going to be a little bit bulky if I leave that permanently. I could come in here and trim them. That's up to you. This time I haven't trimmed my square of fabric down. So again, I need another paper piece. And this is something that a friend of mine does that I think is really smart. She goes in and punches a hole somewhere near the center of whatever her paper piece is. And now I can't get exactly to the center because my punch doesn't reach that far. And then in that hole, she pins through. So I'm just catching it with the pin inside the hole. And you don't have to have the hole. You could actually pin right through the paper, but the hole just makes it easier to get it every time. So this time I'm going to trim it down. I'm leaving, at least 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, maybe a little better. I'm just getting the excess out of there. Okay. Now I could use the paper clip still if I want to. I'm going to do it without this time just so you can see. I have a knot in my basting thread. I'm going to fold my fabric over, and again, so I get a corner. I'm going to do exactly the same thing as I did last time. I'm going to take a stitch through those layers of fabric. I am not stitching through the paper, and then I'm going to come back and do another one right on top of it. And then I will go to the next, and I'm just pressing the fabric over with my fingers as I go this time. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing as I did last time, going all the way around. Just catching those corners with 2 stitches or a back stitch. So I'm going to go here and here. Now, if I was doing something a little bit bigger than that and I don't want, or if you just don't like this thread hanging out there, you can take a little stitch through the fabric in the middle. I'm still not stitching through the paper. Now, if I was doing a piece that was a lot bigger, I might actually need to stitch through the paper using this method. But I'm just going to go all the way around, catching those corners, just like I did on the last one. I've stitched all the way around my piece, and now I can pull the pin out. I do want to point out I am not taking my papers out after I baste around it. The papers are going to stay in until we get the whole thing together. I've prepared this one exactly like I did the last one. I put a hole in it, put a pin in, and trimmed, leaving a seam allowance. But this time I'm going to use glue. This is a Sew Line fabric glue pin. They come in, I think, at least 3 different colors. Mine happens to be blue. It doesn't really make any difference because they dry clear. So it's like a pin. I'm going to open it up, and there's the blue in there. That's the glue. So with this method, I am going to glue on the paper. So you can see the blue probably right there. I'm going to fold down my fabric on top of the glue, press. And then when I go to do the next section, I'm going to get some glue on the fabric, bringing my fabric over and finger press it in place. And again, and my goal really is to keep most of the glue on the paper other than right there in the corners. And fold it. So this is definitely faster. And if you glue and don't use it right away and find that it starts to come undone, although you should hold quite a while, you can just put a little more glue under the spots that have come undone, and then here goes glue here, here. and glue in place. And I can still reuse my papers with the glue. So there's kind of 2.5 methods. You can choose which one you want. It doesn't really make any difference for the end product, or you can go online and find some other ones. After preparing all my hexagons, I've arranged them the way I intend to sew them together. Could change between now and I finish. I am going to be sewing them together by hand. I'm using a 60 weight thread just like I use for applique, but you could also use an 80 or 100 weight. You're usually going to want your colors to match. I'm going to use a white thread, so hopefully you can see it a little bit while I'm sewing. So I'm going to just take the two that I want to sew together. So I'm going to flip this one on top of my center one, and I'm going to match it up. I'm going to take this away so that the background's not confusing. So I'm going to match up the edge that I'm going to sew, and I also want to match up those points. There's a couple ways I can start. Some places suggest that I slide my needle under the fabric, between the fabric and the paper, and come out on the point, and that will work. And some other places suggest taking a couple of stitches in my seam allowance to work my way up to that point. So and that will kind of hold your thread, because you don't want it pulling out, especially if you were making a bed quilt. You don't want those corners pulling out. So I'm going to be using a whip stitch to sew this together. And I can just hold it with my fingers if I want to, but I kind of like a wonder clip, and I just put it on right next to the edge that I'm sewing, not on the one that I'm sewing. All right, so now I'm going to start right there in that corner, and I want it to hit that corner well. So I'm going to stitch from one side to the other through a couple threads in the fabric and pull it up, and I'm going to take a second stitch in that corner just to really reinforce it, and then I'm just going to flip my thread around my needle so I get a loop in there and it puts a knot. And then I'm just going to continue sewing. I'm going to go in on one side and out on the other, just catching a couple threads. I am not catching the paper, and I will be doing my stitches fairly close together. So it's just in on one side, out on the other, and then thread crosses over so that I come back and go in on the same side that I went in on last time. Out on the other side, catching a couple threads. So my stitches are maybe a 1/16 of an inch apart. I'm just going to keep stitching all the way down to the other end. When I get to within a couple stitches of that last corner, then I will come back and show you how I'm finishing it off. I'm a couple stitches from the corner, so I'm going to just continue doing my whip stitch. And then in the corner, I'm going to take a stitch right in the corner, and I'm going to do another one. And this time I'm going to leave a loop and then bring my needle through it to put a knot in there. Now I'm not going to cut my threads at this point because I will be adding to this. So there's my first edge cut, so I'll be adding, so there's no reason to cut my threads. I can just use it to continue on. Okay, so I've just set the piece back in here that I just stitched, and the direction I'm going, my next piece to go on is going to be this one. So I'm going to fold it down on top of the yellow, and I can just keep stitching on around. So again, I'm stitching right along this side now. I'm going to go into the corner on my new piece. I'm going to take another stitch there. I'm going to wrap my thread around my needle so that I get a knot. And then I'm just going to sew to the other end. I'm coming up on my point again, so I'm just going to keep stitching until I get to the point. Take a stitch right there in the point, and then I'm going to do another one. Going to leave a loop there, and then just bring my needle through the loop to get a knot. And again, I'm not going to cut my thread off. So now I have this piece back in here and I'm going to sew this piece on next. Now, just because I'm doing it in this order doesn't mean that that's the right way to do it or the only way to do it. You could actually sew this whole ring together. Just start by sewing it in pairs and then sew the pairs together and then set your piece into the center. It's just adding the pieces together, so you're just always going to be sewing those edges together to your points. So I'm going to go ahead and finish adding my pinks on, and right now they're just kind of flapping on there, so I will come back and show you more after I get my pink sewn all the way around. I've sewn my pinks on all 6 sides of the yellow, but they're still just loose petals. So now I need to start sewing those seams together. So all I have to do is bend it, because my paper will bend. And now I'm going to sew from this point to this point. It's going to be exactly the same as we did before. I'm not creasing this, it bends. So I have actually cut my thread. Zoom in a little more. I'm going to do the same thing I did before, just take a few stitches in the seam allowance into the corner. Oops, and it would help if I had a knot. Taking a few stitches into the corner. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before. Take a stitch in the point. I'm going to do one more and do the little knot in it. We could either do the wrap around the needle or go through the loop. Okay, I'm going to show you the ladder stitch. So my first video on the ladder stitch was something of a failure, so I am working with a different piece. So I've done my knot in the corner, and I'm going to travel forward for my next stitch by running the needle inside the fold, forward however far I want for my next stitch. So I'm running inside the fold on one side, so I'm actually on this side. I bring my thread through, and then I just cross straight over from where my thread came up and put my needle back down in the fold on the other piece, or on the other side. And again, I'm going to travel forward inside the fold. I'm going to bring my needle up, and I don't have to pull my threads tight every single time. I'm going to cross straight over from where my thread came up here into the other piece, go down in the fold, travel forward, and again come back over to this side, down in the fold, travel forward. After I've done a few stitches, then I do want to go ahead and pull it up so that all my stitches sink in. So I'm up on this side, so now I'm going to go straight across, down in the fold on the opposite side. And I'm just running my needle inside that fold up to where I want my next stitch to be. Cross over to this side, running inside the fold. So what this stitch does is there's less thread sitting on top. And some people think that you get a neater stitch this way. I think you can go either way. When I get to the point, I'm going to knot off exactly the same way. So again, so I'm bouncing back and forth between sides. I'm traveling forward for each stitch on every other side. So one stitch I'm traveling forward on the piece on this side, the next stitch I'm traveling forward with the piece on this side. So take your pick, whip stitch or ladder stitch. Obviously I'm having a harder time doing the ladder stitch in front of the camera, but it is a nice stitch. I've only sewn this one seam right here, and I could cut my thread and start over again, but I would rather sew as much as I can before cutting the thread, and that's just personal preference. So I can take this one now, flip, it's going to be fitting in here. So I'm going to flip it down. I could go either way. I could either go across here, or I could flip it this way and go that way. It's completely up to you. But I'm just going to sew him in there, sew that one in there, and then I'll move on to my next piece and sew it in. This piece is stitched onto here now. So now, because my thread's coming out on this end, and my personal challenge is to sew as far as I can without having to cut the thread, I can either join it here or here. Doesn't really make any difference. I did want to show you that my paper starting to come out of my center one, which is okay. This is one that was glued. If I didn't want it out yet, then I could just put some more glue in there. But because I have stitched all the way around it, it would be okay to remove my paper now. So I can just pop it out. I'm not going to, but you could. I'm just going to keep adding pieces one at a time, just like I've shown you. If you will just worry about the side you're stitching, then it's pretty easy. It's just that side and then the corner and then the next side. And you don't have, if you were doing this by machine, you would have to cut the hexagons out of the fabric with a seam allowance, and you would have to stop and start at every point and do a back stitch so that it didn't come undone. It can be done, but I do not plan to show it in this video. I've finished sewing my grandmother's flower garden together, and I've already popped out the papers in here because once I have sewn all the way around the shape, I can pop the papers out. But now I need to applique this to the background. So I'm going to need to pop the papers out of here. Before I do that, I have pressed it really well because I'm going to need to have a nice crisp edge around the edges to applique my piece down. So I have pressed it. If you've punched holes in these, then it's really easy to take a seam ripper or a stiletto and just slide it in there and pop your papers out, and you can use them again. So it's just that easy to pop them out, and that's with the basting. If you didn't, you're going to have to still get in there and get them out, and that was a glued one, but since I pressed it, it's folding right back down very nicely. So I'm going to pop all these papers out of here. Here's my finished block. All I need to do now is trim the whole thing down to 12.5 inches, and I did press it already. So half of 12.5 is 6.25. So I'm going to put the 6.25 mark on this direction on my points. And I'm actually going to trim this one section at a time. So now 12.5 on along the line that I just cut. I don't know if you can see. And my 6.25 mark should still be running through the point here and on the seam. So I'm going to cut this side. And then this side's going to be a little bit trickier because I don't have any points to line up with. So 6.25. And I'm looking, and I have about 1.25 from the point over here. So if I look here, I only have about 1 inch, so I need to move it over a little bit more. So I'm at 1.25 there, 1.25 there, and yours may be different. So just pay attention, and I'm going to need to make sure that I have lines running along the 2 edges that I already cut, so everything's square. 1.25. Slide it in just a little bit, and that's pretty good. If it's not exactly dead on, it's not the end of the world. And rotate it, and the last 12.5. I think I was. And trim. So that is my finished grandmother's flower garden block. Now, if I was making a whole quilt with these, I wouldn't be appliquing it down onto a background piece until till I got all the way to the edge. Even then you may not. In that case, I would not have taken these papers out until I had attached it to my next grandmother's flower garden block.